Hello, and welcome to this stream. I hope you are enjoying Tolkien Day so far and looking forward to more fantastic content on the way. Today, we're going to be discussing a chapter that doesn't feature in the Lord of the Rings films, but is a very important chapter in The Return of the King near the end. It's called The Scouring of the Shire. Before we get into the topic itself, we are really privileged to have somebody who's thought a lot about Tolkien and loves Tolkien and is really the architect of Tolkien Day. I'd like to welcome Apostolic Majesty. Hello, Apostolic Majesty.
Hello, everyone. If you haven't had enough of me already today, I'm here to inflict my presence on you even more so. But nevertheless, thank you very much, Nathan, for hosting me. And I need to emphasize that Talking Day is very much a collaboration between Nathan and myself. So I want to thank him as well for suggesting this and helping make this day possible.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you to say. I think I mean, it might be just interesting to mention that part of the genesis of Tolkien Day came from this idea for this stream, because I think it was about 6 months ago on your channel, which I'd recommend everybody subscribe to. We did a couple of videos on the lore of Middle Earth and the characters in Middle Earth, and we'd mentioned maybe doing a stream on the Scouring of the Shire, and it didn't materialize until a couple of weeks ago. We spoke about maybe doing this on Tolkien's birthday, and from there, everything kind of grew organically, like the great party tree in the Shire. So there's something quite fitting about doing this stream today. Before we get into the kind of fullness of the topic, it might be worth just giving a few introductory remarks about this chapter and its importance in the Lord of the Rings, particularly as I've already mentioned, it's not a feature of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy. And this made perfect sense in many ways because it comes after the climax of the main plot, the destruction of Sauron's ring, the Ring of Power, and the defeat of evil. It comes after that, and there's already enough loose ends to tie up that you don't want to start engaging more in the story. And indeed, J.R.R. Tolkien made a similar suggestion when he read over a script given to him in 1957 for a potential film of The Lord of the Rings. He suggested that they remove the Scouring of the Shire because it moves beyond the end of the main plot. However, this chapter, many scholars have suggested, is one of the most important, if not the most important, in The Return of the King. Some have suggested it is almost a microcosm of all of the key themes and plots and ideas in the story as a whole. It also has importance because it's been understood, The Lord of the Rings, as a coming of age story. It begins in the Shire with our four hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, and they have to embark on this quest to destroy the ring. However, the story doesn't end there in the book. They must return to the Shire and redeem it, and we'll see how they do that. And this process of going on the quest for the ring is in itself the process by which they grow, by which they become those capable of saving the Shire in the end. So really, the beginning and the ending mark the key moments in the story. The actual quest for the ring could be seen as a mediating point in that. And to that end, I would just like to read a very short passage from the chapter just before this one, where Gandalf talks about this. They're on their way back to the Shire, and they're a bit worried about what might be happening there. They've heard rumors that dark things are taking place. And Merry says, well, we've got you, that's Gandalf, with us, so things will soon be cleared up. I am with you at present, said Gandalf, but soon I shall not be. I am not coming to the Shire. You must settle its affairs yourselves. That is what you have been trained for. Do you not yet understand? My time is over. It is no longer my task to set things to rights, nor to help folk to do so. And as for you, my dear friends, you will need no help. You are grown up now, grown indeed very high. Among the very great you are. and I have no longer any fear at all for any of you. So we can see within the story itself the idea that the quest for the ring, the overthrow of Sauron in itself, has been a training for our four protagonists to return to the Shire and save it in the chapter The Scouring of the Shire. The other importance of this chapter is what some scholars have described as its applicability. Obviously, The Lord of the Rings is a fantasy, it's got mythological elements, there's lots of strangeness in it, and very different cultures from our own world. But the Shire is that point in which we can see ourselves. The hobbits are the closest we have. They are the everyman, they are our point of entry into the story. And the Shire is supposed to be like our society, or at least Tolkien's society. And so although it's not an allegory of any particular context, Tolkien was very clear on that point, many scholars have read it as commenting on modern British society in various ways. For example, some have spoken about how Tolkien, returning from World War I, would have felt very similar things to Frodo, Sam, and the rest on their return to the Shire. Others have pointed to the socialist government of post-1945 in Britain as something that Tolkien might be commenting on in this chapter. Even others have suggested perhaps something like the Nazis is what Tolkien is examining in this chapter. But there may be an even closer to home commentary that Tolkien's making here. Some of you will know that in his early childhood, J.R.R. Tolkien and his widowed mother moved to Sarehole Mill, or to a cottage near Sarehole Mill, which is at that time would have been outside of Birmingham, a hamlet in the countryside. There was a lovely watermill there with meadows, a bog with a wonderful wood there called Moseley Bog. And the young Tolkien loved exploring and playing in these places. And later in life, he would say that it was the most formative experiences of his life were there in Sarehole Mill. In 1933, Tolkien returned to Sarehole Mill for the first time. And over those years since the early 1900s, it had become a part of Birmingham. Urbanization and industrialization had expanded to incorporate and subsume all these countryside places into it. And this is his diary entry for that experience. I pass over the pangs to me of passing through Hall Green, become a huge tram-ridden, meaningless suburb where I actually lost my way, and eventually down what is left of beloved lanes of childhood, and past the very gate of our cottage, now in the midst of a sea of new red brick. The old mill still stands, and Mrs. Hunt still sticks out into the road as it turns uphill. But the crossing beyond the now fenced-in pool, where the Bluebell Lane ran down into the mill lane, is now a dangerous crossing, alive with motors and red lights. The White Ogre's house, which the children were excited to see, is become a petrol station, and most of Short Avenue and the elms between it and the crossing have gone. How I envy those whose precious early scenery has not been exposed to such violent and peculiarly hideous change. So as we look through the Scouring of Shire, keep in mind these various possible influences and contexts that Tolkien's addressing, and how they may have inspired some of the commentary we're going to look at. AM, is there anything you would like to add by way of introductory remark at this point?
No, I think that's quite comprehensive and very interesting to listen to. Thank you.
Okay, well, I should also say at any point, feel free to jump in.
Yes, absolutely.
So, without further ado, I think it would be helpful just to position where we are in the story up to this point, by way of plot. So, as I alluded to, the main focus of The Lord of the Rings is the quest to destroy the ring, which mainly follows Frodo and Sam. Then you also have the parallel story of the free peoples of Middle-earth resisting Sauron's attempts to conquer them. And both quests have succeeded. The ring is destroyed, and Gondor, there is a new king returned, Aragorn, and peace is made with the enemies of the free peoples. They're either destroyed or made peace with. Healing is brought to the land and to the peoples, and our Hobbit heroes have been celebrated as heroes among men, of having achieved great things. They are on their way back from Gondor to the Shire, and along the way, they bump into one of their former antagonists, Saruman. This point, he is utterly defeated in Isengard. His realm was overtaken by the Ents, and he has managed to escape the Tower of Orthanc with his lackey Wormtongue, or Worm. And AM, would you be willing to fill us in a little bit on what happens in that exchange?
I can't quite recall that exchange in particular, but I think one thing to really elucidate here is when we look at the film, a lot of the elements that cut out of the film, in particular the Shire politics to begin with, as part of Frodo's long sort of meander and eventual sort of leaving of the Shire, it should be noted, this is mainly glossed over in the film. In the film, you get the impression it could take, a few weeks. But this is a process that starts off for several years. And of course, one of the main, political aspects going on in the Shire is a branch of the Baggins family, the Sackville Baggins family, want to take over Bag End. And Bilbo, has essentially taken Frodo under his wing. And it seems very unlikely that the Sackville Bagginses are going to inherit that property. However, in order to fulfill Gandalf's plan to leave the Shire and embark towards Bree and eventually Rivendell, Frodo sells the deed to Bag End to Lobelia Sackville Baggins. And I think that's important to note in terms of when we're talking about the rise of Lotto, and also known as Pimple, and the sundering of the Shire, and all the politics going on before we arrive at that point.
Definitely, and maybe at this point, then we could just discuss the kind of political framework of the Shire as well.
Yeah.
While we're kind of on that, so the Shire doesn't really have a running government in the sense that we would understand it. It is land that was originally gifted by the King of Arnor, so that's the kind of sister kingdom of Gondor in the north. It's where the Rangers have their ancestors. It was gifted.
I think this is quite important to note, because you mentioned, of course, that Aragorn has been restored. Aragorn is now King Elisar, but of course Aragorn was a Dunedain. He was a Ranger of the North, but also he instigates the restoration of the Kingdom of Arnor for the first time in the Fourth Age. We will see the restoration of both Gondor and Arnor. However, that has really yet to be effected so far, and so by the time we look at the Hobbits of the Third Age, the Kingdom of Arnor has basically been destroyed. Fornost and the Old Kingdom is basically dissipated and fragmented, and we have the old Dunedain Rangers, basically patrolling and protecting the Shire from outside invaders, but internally. There is a mayor within Hobbiton. There is a Thane, a Took Thane, of course, Peregrine Took, but this position is virtually ceremonial by this point. And the Shire itself is divided into 4 farthings, and each of these farthings has only a very small amount of sheriffs to keep the hobbits in line. But, by and large, the actual Shire itself is rather anarchic. And what is important to note, and what Frodo continually emphasizes throughout the course of the chapter, The Scouring of the Shire, is that no hobbit has, instigated, the killing of another hobbit, essentially. They can feud, they can bicker, they, are obsessed with their own lineages, but they don't engage in these sort of blood feuds that the other races get engaged in.
That's very helpful, and I think just to add on to that last point, really the only functions of kind of any sort of government are the sheriffs, and prior to the scouring or the sundering of the Shire, really these are like local police but mainly they deal with like lost animals, returning them to their homes, and maybe deal with a few feuding people. But they're not dealing with serious crimes. They're not protecting the Shire against marauding bandits or anything like that, because the Rangers are doing that. And there has become a certain, I think in the prologue, Tolkien talks about how hobbits have become very comfortable, and they think they have forgotten the dangers of the outside world, and indeed even think that maybe the rest of the outside world is quite like the Shire, which it most definitely is not.
Yes, absolutely. They're very insular, and when it comes to the arrival, I mean, obviously, the other parallel to the story, because this isn't just a story about the Shire. This is also a story about Saruman, or Sharky, as he is known in the Scouring of the Shire, and his decline. So, just to summarize essentially what happened to him, of course, Saruman was the head of the White Council. He was the first of the wizards, or the Istari. He was one of the Maya, or the lesser angelic creatures sent over by Eru Ilúvatar to manage the affairs of Middle Earth. However, of course, he betrayed that cause. He attempted, I mean, it's far more sort of ambiguous in the book, but explicit in the film, to either, ally explicitly with Sauron or attempt to supplant him. I would personally favor the latter interpretation. So in that case, Gandalf, of course, Gandalf the Grey dies and is resurrected as Gandalf the White, Saruman as he was meant to have been, and therefore the position and the power of Saruman is effectively supplanted. All the while, Saruman is turning Isengard into, the horrific sort of mire of machinery, factories, forging weapons, Uruk-hai essentially to wipe out the kingdom of Rohan. This fails, and Isengard is beset and destroyed by the Ents with the help of Merry and Pippin. And so Saruman is essentially blockaded in his tower. And, as we mentioned just before the events, Saruman is finally left. But, Isengard is in ruins. He's been deprived of Orthanc. His authority is gone. The ring is lost, so he no longer has that ability to claim absolute power or supplant Sauron. So he has essentially nothing left to him other than his intense hatred for Gandalf, who supplanted him, and for the hobbits. And I think this is important to know in terms of the fundamental difference in philosophy between Gandalf and Saruman. Saruman was drawn and attracted to power, and so was very sort of eager to ally or imitate figures such as Sauron. However, in the case of Gandalf, Gandalf was the exact opposite. He was drawn to the hobbits, who on the surface seemed to be the most unassuming and almost pathetic of all the races of Middle-earth. And yet he was able to understand the latent strengths of the hobbits and how they would be, uniquely lacking in a certain susceptibility to the ring's corruption. And of course, he was completely right. So I think what we're seeing is, a complete failure of Saruman's philosophy on power. And so to this, the hobbits represent not just that Saruman was basically wrong in all of his motivations and all of his aims, but that Gandalf was right, and that there's this particular association between Gandalf and the hobbits, I think, which again really evokes the ire of Saruman and why he would focus on all his attention on the Shire.
Definitely, and you can even see this on the moment where they bump into Saruman on the road back to the Shire when he's left Orthanc. He just has absolute disdain for Gandalf. He has this idea that Gandalf's come here to mock him, even with his offers of repentance that he could have. He characterizes the hobbits as lordlings, and the idea that the hobbits would present themselves as lords is ludicrous to anybody who really understands them. But that's how Saruman thinks about the world. He can only see it understand it in terms of gaining power, and so he interprets the hobbits in that way. He also sees himself as a victim of the hobbits too. He claims that they destroyed his home and took his pipeweed, and so he asks for some of it back, and steals Merry's pouch in the process. But he calls them thieves. So he sees them as having injured him, which is also quite important for understanding.
Yes.
For the Scouring of the Shire.
Yes, I think in terms of in every respect, I think he views his position as having been usurped. He doesn't see that he has been supplanted for a reason. And he doesn't sort of look at the devastation of his home as some form of retribution, not just for the damage he has, wreaked on the countryside, in regards to the Ents, and not only the damage he's wreaked upon Rohan, but the fact that he essentially, tore apart the White Council. None of these things seem to stick to him, and so he essentially left with nothing but his pride and ultimately his envy. I think one, cancerous aspect of Saruman is this all-consuming envy that he has towards Gandalf, and how this is reflected in his hatred of the hobbits. But if it's possible, because I think we are perhaps going too much into depth with regards to the actual sort of theming of the Scouring of the Shire, would it be possible if I very quickly summarize what actually happens? Because I'm working under the assumption that quite a few people wouldn't have necessarily read the books and probably don't know.
Yes, this would be an apt time. So just to say before you get to that, they stop along the way to Rivendell and to Bree, and they get more and more sense, the hobbits, that something bad's going to happen in the Shire. So take it away.
Yes, there is this ever-growing sense of foreboding, which again, the complete antithesis of the films. So yes, they arrive at the gates of the Shire essentially, and one of the remarks that is first made is that it appears very un-Shire-like. There are these weird sheds and contraptions everywhere. Later, Farmer Cotton talks about these outlandish machines that have been put up essentially by the instigation of Sharky Saruman. And what is more is that there is a curfew, and there are no longer just a couple of sheriffs who are, as you mentioned, organizing essentially the animals, but there are sheriffs enforcing this curfew, and there is also a list of rules. And so, just to illustrate how far the four hobbits have come, Sam has, of course, been, Frodo's strength, and has been one of the most courageous of all the characters in Lord of the Rings. Frodo, of course, has borne the full sort of malice of Sauron and carried the ring and successfully, albeit he failed right at the end. He played a significant part in destroying the ring. With both Pippin and Meriadoc, this is important. Pippin has submitted himself as a servant of the Kingdom of Gondor, and Meriadoc has done so likewise for the Kingdom of Rohan. And so, in the case of Merry, this is exhibited with his having the horn of the Mark, or the horn of Rohan, which was, if I recall, given to him by Éomer after the Battle of Pelennor Fields.
Yes. Yes.
So, these characters have, in every sense, sort of become worldly. They have become the antithesis of what, we would expect from a hobbit. They have joined, they have collaborated, they have fought alongside and in the service of kings. And in the case of Sam and Frodo, they are literally responsible for saving the world. And they come back, and there are these, pathetic, fearful, hobbit folk. Essentially, they recognize them, but they're essentially strangers in all their mannerisms. And one of the, the reaction from all the hobbits, except for Frodo, is far more pensive throughout this, is almost whimsy. It's almost flippancy. They look at the hobbits and they don't sort of take anything seriously. They're still anticipating that things, were as they were when they left, essentially, and they cannot, understand this new world that has been, inflicted upon on the Shire. And so, very quickly, the long list of rules is torn down, and they're looking for lodgings, and then they encounter these various ruffians. For people who don't know, Saruman had impressed the services of various evil men, in particular the Dunlanders, relatively north of Isengard, around east of the area of Bree and Eriador. And many of these men are now sort of intimidating Shire folk around the Shire, albeit there are many. I think in the chapter it's mentioned that there are as many as 100 sheriffs, in contrast to the dozen or so sheriffs for the entire Four Farthings.
Mhm.
And not only that, but they encounter that much of the food is gone. They call this sharers and gatherers, but there's a lot more gathering going on than there is sharing. Also, all the alcohol is gone. The Green Dragon Inn is essentially empty and derelict, and it's only the ruffians who are essentially keeping all the alcohol to themselves.
For the
And as
fairer
this,
distribution of the alcohol, you mean? That's what they say.
yes, a fairer distribution of the alcohol to those who really deserve it. So, as people who know, the hobbits are a very jovial bunch. The hobbits love eating. If any sort of sin, that they embody. If every single race in the Lord of the Rings were to embody a sin, with the hobbits it would be gluttony. All of this is taken away from the hobbits, and you have these rather, scared sheriffs enforcing these rules they don't understand. One point I think is made that there is a shortage of everything except rules. The economic and political condition of the Shire is, rapidly deteriorating, and but the amount of sort of the totalitarian nature of the rule in the Shire is growing. And at first they're wondering who is responsible for this, and it is the so-called chief sheriff, or just the chief. And it later transpires that they think that this person is Lotto Sackville Baggins, the son of Lobelia, who had purchased the rights to Bag End. And essentially Bag End is, from being the home of Bilbo and briefly Frodo, has essentially been turned into this headquarters for this new regime. As they progress through the Shire, it quickly transpires that the hobbits are scared. They're very unhappy with this regime, but the four members of the Fellowship, the four hobbits, are very successfully able to scare away many of the earlier sort of iterations of the ruffians and steal the resolve of the hobbits to try and fight back what they consider ultimately a ridiculous new system that's been imposed on them, a completely alien system that's been imposed on them. Nevertheless, as the story progresses, it gets darker. So they discuss essentially what has happened with Farmer Cotton, and he essentially describes the process by which the Shire piecemeal had been bought up, and many of the assets of the Shire have basically been stripped away and sent elsewhere by Lotto Sackville Baggins. It's later transpired that he's made a rather terrible ally. And in the process of Hobbit dissatisfaction with Lotto and his growing power, we see the arrival of these ruffians, and very soon these ruffians begin to act in a completely lawless manner and begin to intimidate and essentially lord over the hobbits. From then, Pippin in particular becomes far more bellicose, albeit Frodo is more pensive. And there is this idea of taking back power from Lotto Sackville Baggins, and then the ruffians begin to talk about this mysterious figure known as Sharky. And I think Frodo first sort of understands that I don't feel now that even Lotto, or as he's also known, Pimple, really understands what's going on. Rather that he's essentially been overcome by events and he's no longer in control. Rather, it's this Sharky character that is controlling everything. So it's not going to be a coup against Lotto, but rather it's going to be a rescue of him from Bag End. And with the culmination of Merry rallying the various hobbits, and Pippin and Sam in particular, we have the oh my goodness, it's going to hurt me. The Battle of the Bywater, is that what it's called?
That's correct.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I did ruin that one. And some 70 ruffians are dead. There are unfortunately 19 hobbits killed in the process. I think it's the first battle in the Shire for some 350 years, just to illustrate how abnormal the situation was.
And the last one.
And the last one, yes, is definitive in the book that this will be the last battle ever fought in the Shire. And so they finally arrive at Bag End. And again, the horror. I think this is probably one of the weakest moments in the chapter. It's when Sam says this is worse than Mordor, because I really think that's something that doesn't need to be said. It's something that can be inferred by the reader. It doesn't need to be stated so obviously, but again, explicitly, because it is all the horrors of Mordor which have been brought home. And this is exemplified in the fact that Bag End is covered. It's essentially a shanty town. And when they go into Bag End, Lotto is nowhere to be seen. There are rats and mice everywhere. And as they're lamenting the situation they find themselves in the doorway, it so transpires that Saruman has appeared. And Saruman is, as you mentioned, the alluding to the earlier themes, he is spitting this hatred towards the hobbits for ruining his home, that this is some form of rightful revenge, essentially, that he has been able to inflict upon the Shire and on Bilbo Baggins's home in particular. However, given all the provocation, Frodo, who has truly transcended Saruman in every possible way at this point, allows Saruman to go, and rather than doing so, he attempts to murder Frodo, only for the dagger that Saruman has to break on Frodo's mithril armor, therefore rendering the assassination attempt useless. So even cheated of that petty revenge, and again showing the limitations of Saruman's power, he then calls on Wormtongue, who is now, even Wormtongue is degenerated, and Wormtongue is now just a dog, essentially called Worm. Worm essentially, has become this pathetic, hateful creature. Yet he is ultimately the one who takes his revenge on Saruman as he is leaving, or Sharky. And when Sharky dies, essentially it's such a sort of non-event. Many of the Shire folk are still, greatly intimidated by Saruman due to his reputation and the fact that he is still able to use his magic speech. But even then, when we see his death, he, literally disintegrates and becomes essentially a puff of grey smoke. And I think it's this perfect illustration of the complete sort of moral and personal collapse of Saruman in every possible sense, and how the hobbits, as you mentioned, they have grown. They have been able to deal with the situation effectively. They've been able to retake the hobbit. They've been able to provide the strength for the hobbits, which obviously they themselves did not possess at the time, but rather you can say actually they inspired that strength in the hobbits. They were able to shake off this rather, again, I want to iterate, pathetic system that's been established. I mean, everything about this regime, it's all it took essentially was 4 courageous hobbits to, albeit with a few a few sort of alterations along the way, to rid the Shire of this tyranny. And it really is, I think, at the end of it, you're just left with this this feeling of bitterness, but you're also left with this moment of admiration and respect, especially for Frodo, for having come so far and having resolved the situation.
Thank you, AM. That was a really great summary of the chapter, and I think you're so right that it leaves you with a mixture of emotions, lament for what has happened, bewilderment at how it happened. As you said, it took 4 hobbits to overthrow this bunch of cowards. Essentially, a lot of them are. They run away as soon as there's trouble, but also admiration for the strength of character that the 4 hobbits show in overthrowing it, and it's very inspiring for current context as well. I think it'd be good just to break down some of the things, or just add to some of the things that you mentioned in the summary. And I think what we could really say is that what Saruman's trying to do is turn the Shire into the opposite of itself, or almost take everything that's essential to it and twist it away from that to make it something else. And so for example, you mentioned that there were bans on eating extra food, on drinking beer, on smoking tobacco, on offering hospitality. These are all things essential to who hobbits are and what they value. They're an eating and drinking culture. They have parties nearly every week where they invite their families and friends round to carouse. To take these things away from hobbits is to fundamentally deny the quintessential character of their culture. And so that's what part of this is. Another aspect would be when they go through the various places, they see gardens which are filled with weeds. Now, in the prologue, Tolkien talks about how hobbits are creatures that love a well-ordered garden, and many
Yes.
of them love gardening. Sam is a perfect example of this. So to have created conditions where gardens can be left untamed, that just shows how unnatural this is for hobbits to be living under this tyranny where they have to ask permission to walk down the street or to even have a gate on the Brandywine Bridge. That just tying it back into the kingdom of Anor, one of the conditions for giving the gift of the Shire to the hobbits was that they maintain the roads and allow the king's messengers to pass through freely and have board by placing gates on the bridge. It's directly in contradiction to this foundational promise of the Shire, and specifically to Pippin, who is, as you mentioned, the king's servant or the king's messenger. So there's fundamental things that are being attacked. It's not just any old tyranny. It's really targeting things.
Yes.
The good things about the Shire.
And that's an explicit mention by Pippin regarding the fact he does see himself essentially as the Gondorian or Arnorian envoy. If it's possible, I would like to just read a couple of just short passages relating to the devastation of the Shire. I mean, it is quite sort of gut punching reading this. I mean, it does sort of take you down, bring you down after reading the highs of the reformation of the Kingdom of Gondor and the destruction of the Ring.
Please do.
The travellers trotted on, and as the sun began to sink towards the white downs, far away on the western horizon, they came to Bywater, by its wide pool, and there they had their first painful shock. This was Frodo and Sam's own country, and they found out now that they cared about it more than any other place in the world. Many of the houses that they had known were missing. Some seemed to have burnt down. The pleasant row of old hobbit holes in the bank on the north side of the pool were deserted, and their little gardens that used to run down bright to the water's edge were rank with weeds. Worse, there was a whole line of ugly new houses along the poolside, where the Hobbiton Road ran close to the bank. An avenue of trees had stood there. They were all gone, and looking with dismay up the road towards Bag End, they saw a tall chimney of brick in the distance. It was pouring out black smoke into the evening air. And there's this, let me just find it quickly, this other chapter. There's this one character, Lotto was ultimately sort of a rather tragic figure, but one of the unrepentant collaborators in the Shire is Sandyman. And this is what Cotton has to say about Sandyman's Mill. And this, of course, is later when Cotton is recounting what essentially has gone on in their absence. Take Sandyman's Mill now. Pimple, i.e. Lotto, knocked it down almost as soon as he came to Bag End. Then he brought in a lot of dirty-looking men to build a bigger one and fill it full of wheels and outlandish contraptions. Only that fool Ted was pleased by that, Ted Sandyman, and he works there cleaning wheels for the men, whereas Dab was the miller and his own master. Pimple's idea was to grind more and faster, or so he said. He got other mills like it, but you've got to have grist before you can grind, and there was no more for the new mill to do more than the old. But since Sharkey came down, they don't grind no more corn at all. They're always a hammering and a letting out a smoke and a stench, and there isn't no peace even at night in Hobbiton. And they pour out filth a purpose. They fouled all the lower water, and it's getting down into the Brandywine. If they want to make the Shire into a desert, they're going the right way about it. So yes, I think the consensus is obviously that things are pretty terrible in the Shire. And I think obviously latent aspects of industrialization, urbanization, uglification, if that's a word. Obviously, I think many of us are conservationists in the conservative sense. We don't like to see these sprawling shanty towns eclipse, our green and pleasant land, essentially. And yes, there are sort of allusions to that. And I think, given the predicament we're in and the ugliness of the modern world, especially when it comes to modern aesthetics, architecture in particular, this is something that's always had a sort of great effect on me.
And just to kind of build on that, it's really interesting that what Cotton identifies as the key justification for this, at least by Sandyman and Lotto too, is a desire for efficiency in productivity, and also, I guess, the reign of quantity, the expansion of business.
Well,
It's
that's
a
the great
desire.
irony, because this is the parallel to this is obviously, the hobbits are, they're used to good harvests. They're used to having these luxurious parties. They're used to celebrating each other's birthday parties all the time. And yet, with the advent of these new efficient industrial methods, so to speak, it corresponds with a political change where all of the surplus gatherings, all the surplus produce of the hobbits is taken away and stored in granaries, and they never see it. So the hobbits are actually relatively malnourished for the first time, yet the people who are sort of creating these machines are now focusing on efficiency. They're focusing on maximizing produce, but they're not sending it to the Shire folk. They're sending it out of the Shire.
It's they're not an end in themselves. It's the profit that's an end in itself. And I mean, it's not actually said in the text, but there is the indication that some of this must have ended up in Isengard. That's how the pipe leaf must have been there through Lotto sending it there.
Yes, I think that's the implication. I mean, I think there is one explicit reference to things are moving out and eastwards. But yes, I think there is this explicit mention, almost as if the Shire has almost become an economic zone, as horrific as that notion sounds to us. But all of these elements are here. You sent me a few notes before we went on this, and one particular thing interested me, which is talking about the notion that the hobbits were a high trust society, and how this system was able to impose itself essentially with no resistance from the hobbits whatsoever, which I think is important to notice. The first resistance to this regime is when Meriadoc, Peregrine, Samwise, and Frodo re-emerge, because they've gained so much from this experience. They're aware that this is an aberration. This is some sort of tyrannical imposition on the Shire. But the Shire folk, again, out of cowardice or whatever, complacency, have more or less accepted this.
Well, I think in part we can look at the ideas of Carl Schmitt as a helpful kind of lens for this. He speaks about how a genuinely political people, or people who are a political body, have a sense of that there is an enemy who is an existential threat to their survival. And so they order themselves in accordance with that. They form what he would call a man ring, which is those in the ring are your friends and those outside are your enemies, and you must fight your enemies to maintain your man ring. The Shire folk don't have that. They are very comfortable in their existence, and they're not aware of the threats to their survival. So when somebody enters into that, they have no man ring to defend. They are subject to that. At the same time, I would also suggest that actually they are overly suspicious of things which aren't really evil. You see in the kind of early chapters, lots of hobbits talking about those are queer folk abroad, or those other hobbits. So the folks in Hobbiton, the hobbits in Hobbiton, regard the ones in Buckland as queer or strange because they swim in the water. Now, this comes over as quite quaint, but actually what it reveals is they don't have a very good judgment as to who's a friend and who's an enemy. They'll think a hobbit who swims is an enemy in some regard.
Yes, and these are all hobbits referring to other hobbits, because of course the Shire isn't just one place. I think that's probably actually a failing of the film, is that I think we
Mm,
always assume with the film that the Shire is Hobbiton. But the Shire is quite expansive. It's um, dozens, if not hundreds, of miles across, and it comprises, as you mentioned, the Gift of Arnor, a large part of the region of Eriador, which is in the northwest. So this is a large region. It's divided into four main sections, and there are these petty, it has to be emphasized, petty rivalries between the Brandy Bucks, etc., and the other families, and the Tooks, etc. They all have their own reputations. The Sackville Bagginses, of course.
mm,
And of course, this is elucidated in the Fellowship. All of this, and I think this is why I need to emphasize that this is probably one of the most controversial aspects of the adaptation, is that this is all set up in the Fellowship of the Ring. All the elements are there which anticipate what will happen with the Scouring of the Shire, and the petty nature of the internal politics of the Shire, as you mentioned, and their inability to actually sense a real threat, I think is key to sort of emphasizing this, how they essentially allow the Dunlanders, the ruffians, to come in, and how essentially we have this rather sort of, you can almost argue, a police force by consent, and even they're not really a police force. A
mm.
couple of watchers at the borders, and that's it. Of course, the Dunedain Rangers have essentially all died out, and those who haven't have been off fighting the War of the Ring. So we're now in this remarkable situation where you can argue for the first time that the Shire has basically outsourced its defense to the Dunedain, and that is no longer the case. So when they're encountering a rather, again, needs to be emphasized, pathetic force, Saruman at his absolute weakest, there is nothing within the Shire that can actually defend against this. And of course, they are sort of naturally trusting. And,
Mm.
so when it is hobbits becoming sheriffs, essentially, and the idea that there's been no sort of great bloody civil war between hobbits, I think the fact that so many hobbits out of fear, I think this is a key emphasis. There are some people who do not relent, like Sandyman. Lotto is a tragedy of this. But most of them are there because of fear. But it's hobbits doing it to other hobbits. They've created this regime almost in part because of their own cowardice, and that I think is partly responsible for the awful predicament. The idea that the hobbits actually have to fight for something, and they're actually having to contend with this notion of seriously fighting each other and not engaging in these petty family squabbles, is something that almost transcends them as a people, and which is why it takes people who have essentially become outsiders, namely the four Hobbit heroes, to actually find a tangible solution to this, and they do it very quickly.
Extremely quickly, and I think as well there's particulars with Merry and Pippin's stories which enable them to really, they're the primary leaders of the conflict. Sam, I think, is much more involved with the healing process
Hmm.
after, and Frodo is almost limiting or directing from afar. But it's Merry and Pippin who take the main forefront of the resistance. And if we look at their stories, what we see is, but they both physically grow, drinking Ent draft,
Yes.
which makes them much bigger than most hobbits. But their ability to discern what is right and wrong really grows through the story. In particular, with Merry, he has to go against his king. He's pledged his servants to King Theoden of Rohan, but the king commands him to stay behind because he's not big enough to fight in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. He disobeys this command out of love for his friends, his desire to fight, and ultimately his decision is vindicated when it is his stabbing of the Witch King of Agmar which allows Eowyn to slay him and thus defend King Theoden. On the other side, Pippin, who pledges his fealty to Denethor, the steward of Gondor, must break his oath of loyalty and obedience to defend Denethor's son Faramir from
Hmm.
being burned alive. So both of these characters have gone through experiences where they have to break the rules to do the right thing, and not just any rules, but rules of loyalty and obedience that one would normally uphold with one's life. So, and I think it's worth bearing in mind, hobbits are probably they love order in their society. They love ordered business. They like to abide by rules. There's probably a great tension there, not just fear, but a conflict of, should I break the rules here? Is that the right thing to do? These hobbits know when it is right to do so, because they've lived through experiences where they've had to do these things. So they have the moral fortitude, discernment, and courage to be able to stand up to these pathetic and tyrannical rules.
Yes, I think that's a very good summary, and I think within that there was probably the kernel as to people are asking probably why was this scene cut, and what you can probably argue is that all of these elements have already been demonstrated. They've been demonstrated with Merry, they've been demonstrated with Pippin in the case of Pelennor, in the case of Faramir, they've been demonstrated with Sam and Frodo in the case of destroying the ring. So what this is almost I'm not going to say a regurgitation, but this is a confirmation essentially of everything that's preceded. It is a wedding of all these elements and demonstrating how far they have come. But it isn't anything new. The characters don't grow essentially throughout all of this.
No.
The hobbits grow from this, but the four characters themselves do not grow. Saruman doesn't grow either. Saruman, this is the end of Saruman as a character. Nor does Wormtongue grow either. I think, if anything, this is the ultimate sort of moment of growing up, and I think you can say that this is the most important battle of all, because this is the battle regarding home, and everything that has happened before then has set them up for this, for the liberation of the Shire. I think when looking at Peter Jackson's motivations, I think obviously there is the centrality of the conflict regarding the ring. I think one could rightly say, what is the real struggle? Is the struggle against Saruman, is it against the Ruffians, or is it against destroying Sauron? I almost think it's almost like a childish notion that you destroy the ring, which should be mentioned. The ring is just the malice, the essence of one of the corrupted Maiar, namely Sauron. It doesn't represent all evil, which was, the inception of Melkor, essentially, the discordant nature of the music of the Ainur. So evil in some form still exists in the Lord of the Rings, even after Sauron's gone. The greatest evil is gone, yes, but Saruman is still around. And we have these pathetic, covetous men going around and ransacking the Shire. So I think it's almost an emphasis that even though we've won the war, we need to almost be vigilant again, that no such situation can ever arise, and that it almost requires these characters to go through this and reclaim their homeland, reclaim the Shire essentially, and begin the process of rebuilding. And that process can really commence the Fourth Age proper, and with it the reconsecration of the Kingdom of Arnor in the north.
There's a really interesting tie-in with, I guess, the real world in this regard, because some scholars have suggested that so at the moment when the Shire is roused and the hobbits flood to the cause of revolution, I guess, or overthrow of this tyranny, is Meriadoc blowing the horn of Rohan. And this horn is far superior to any of the kind of horns that have been blown so far in the chapter to warn the ruffians that there is resistance. It rings out clearly, and it's like awake, thou Shirelings. And maybe some scholars have suggested that almost this chapter in the Lord of the Rings could be seen as Tolkien's blowing of his horn for his own day, in terms of trying to rouse the people of England to their own vigilance after World War II, and facing the various challenges of industrialization, of, I guess, some have said socialism with the gatherers and the sharers.
Yeah.
And just evil itself, just being aware of that this chapter is Tolkien's Horn of Rohan, as it were, and that would tie in as well with Rohan and its kind of Saxon influences, and Tolkien very much loving that vision of England as Saxon.
Yes, quite a few points just to bring up there. Just on a character note, just to emphasize why I love the blowing of the Horn of Rohan. Of course, the ending and the ending, the Fellowship of the Ring, the beginning of the two towers, is the Boromir blowing the horn of Gondor, and of course that is in defense of Meriadoc and Pippin, but of course it is blown out of despair, and he is killed in the process, and the hobbits are captured. However, I think this is the corollary to that. This is the flipping of that. This is the moment of triumph, when this is not a moment of despair. This is a moment of victory, which again acts as the parallel to Boromir's and the blowing of Gondor. Of course, the breaking of the horn of Gondor. Another point you mentioned, which I think is a very broad point you can mention, about the modern day parallels one can draw. I think to our audience, who I hope are quite perceptive, we are alluding to certain things which many of us can't sadly talk about on YouTube, but I think you can insinuate sort of what the implications are of what Tolkien essentially is saying regarding the explicit sort of historical relation one can draw with Tolkien. Of course, he did go to war. He fought in the Battle of the Somme. He was invalided because of trench foot in late 1916, and he spent the rest of the war, on garrison duty, essentially, around the Humber, etc. From 1917 through actually to 1920, after the war had, long been over. And of course, when we look at the First World War, I would argue it was one of Britain's great original sins. But the First World War is a great sense of transformation. You mentioned the idea of curfews, you mentioned the idea of martial law, mentioned the idea of restrictions on drinking. Elements of this were all the result of David Lloyd George's home war efforts, essentially. So Tolkien would have been familiar with this, and familiar, having gone to war, having come back, and having seen essentially that his friend, in the case of the Barovian Society, his friends were of course killed at the Somme, and of course that isn't the case luckily with the Lord of the Rings. Rather, it is a war story, but it is also a story of the indomitable friendship of those four hobbits. They come back. They all come back from the war. None of them have died, and they are able to affect this revolution, as you mentioned. Merry is able to blow in the horn of Rohan and instigate this revolt. Of course, that doesn't happen in England. Tolkien comes back essentially alone. He comes back to his wife Edith, and we're now in the situation where everything has changed and there is no going back. And this is only confirmed. It is not in any way mitigated with the victory against Germany in 1945, or rather we can say Britain wasn't necessarily victorious, but it wasn't defeated. In many ways it was defeated during that war. And all of these elements are at play, and of course add to that, and we talk about the Westland countryside becoming subsumed into the sprawling metropolis that is Birmingham. All of these elements you can read in here. There's one last point I want to bring up, which you brought about the nature of Rohan and how is Rohan related to the Shire. This is a rather interesting point, because if you sort of understand the Shire within the context of Tolkien lore and the Silmarillion, etc., of course the Hobbits were a much later invention to the lore. Bilbo Baggins was conceived of sometime during the early 1930s. The first draft of The Hobbit was produced sometime before 1935. And it was meant essentially to be a children's book which drew upon the lore, but wouldn't essentially form the lore of the Lord of the Rings. But of course, that's what happened, partly because that's what the publishers, Allen and Unwin, wanted for Tolkien's work. And as a result of that, the Shire is this point of entry for the reader. It is almost like a time capsule. It is not really related at all to the other time periods during Lord of the Rings. I mean, linguistically, because of course Tolkien was a philologist. The great anachronism for the Shire is that the Shire is relatively modern in its speech patterns. And then, of course, you have Rohan. Both Rohan and the Shire are forms of England. Rohan is Tolkien's sort of grand fusion of Gothic Germanic civilization in the East, combined with the idea of the mark of the Kingdom of Mercia. So I think, looking at the Horn of Rohan, I think it is this wedding of these two ideas of England, albeit within the strict sense of Tolkien's mythology, they do seem rather anachronistic.
There's almost a sense in which the kind of vision of the Kingdom of Mercia is almost giving lifeblood back to the Shire in some way, as it's been as it's forgotten itself. And kind of on that note, kind of moving on to just a further reason as to why this happened to the Shire. I just wanted to explore Lotto's motivations a little bit, because he's really the instigator of this whole process. He's the one that allows the ruffians and eventually Saruman to enter into the Shire. It's not a kind of blunt invasion. It's welcomed in by somebody. And Farmer Cotton, I'll just read a very short passage as to what he thinks Lotto's motivations were. It all began with Pimple, as we call him, and it began as soon as you'd gone off, Mr. Frodo. He'd funny ideas, had Pimple. Seems he wanted to own everything himself and then order other folk about. It soon came out that he already did own a sight more than was good for him, and he was always grabbing more, though where he got the money was a mystery. Mills and malt houses and inns and farms and leaf plantations. He'd already bought Sandyman's mill before he came to Bag End, seemingly. So there's a kind of dual motivation here. He wants to own everything himself, and he wants to order other people about. And we see the latter. Well, we see the former in the fact he acquires most of the Shire, probably through money given to him indirectly by Saruman. And he wants to order people about. And we see this in the fact that the mayor of the Shire is arrested for resisting these changes.
Yes.
And Lotto appoints himself chief sheriff, which would have been a position that the mayor held. So and this is an elected position, so he just appoints himself. He usurps a position that is not rightfully his.
And he puts him in the Lochole as well, and threatens the same fate to anyone else as well. Yeah, so it is it is a coup. It is, first of all, you have a financial coup, and then you have the military coup to boot.
And I think this idea points to the very nature of evil within the whole of the Lord of the Rings. Sauron is a character who wants to rule everything and own everything. Saruman is the same, and Lotto, in his own small way, wants to do that with the Shire. He wants to, but with all of these cases, they don't have the right to rule everything, and they don't have the right to own everything. And Lotto is like that too. He, as Cotton says, he owned more than was good for him. Hobbits are a society which, as we've alluded to, they very much make enough to subsist and have a good life on, but they're not looking to increasingly expand it beyond what's natural for them. Lotto wants to expand his property owning beyond what's natural for him, and that's kind of manifested in the idea of the corporation he's building of the Shire. He wants to rule other people without the legitimacy of an election or of kind of the bounds of what rulership should be, and so he has to force people through the ruffians to obey him through violence, through enforcing rules, and eventually he is a victim of his own system that he's invited.
Yes, it's a very apt Tolkien quote, which I think summarizes this perfectly. The most improper job of any man is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, least of all those who seek the opportunity. I think that perfectly summarizes Pimple. But yes, I think this draws upon many questions regarding many of the predicaments we face as to where does legitimacy lie, where is the true source of power, essentially. And this is alluded to significantly, because even though we have one of the Shire folk, ostensibly Lotto Sackville Baggins, taking over the formal sort of rule, or usurpation, dictatorship, whatever, as the chief sheriff. Really, he's always only a puppet for Sharky, and only the Dunlanders sort of know of Sharky and know him affectionately as Sharky since when he was ordering them around at Orthanc. So already we have this usurper who already has become a nothing but a puppet to the real authority, which is lurking behind the scenes somewhere else, which ultimately, thankfully for the Hobbits, is exposed as Saruman. In the end, there is a clear antagonist, and yes, I think towards the end I'd like to read his demise. I think it's really worth reading. But yes, I think many of these elements, the nature of authority, all of this is completely turning the nature of what it means to be a Shire folk. The nature of the Shire is turned upside down, as you've alluded to. And of course, the first thing they notice upon returning is that things are looking very un-Shire-like.
Definitely. And just before you go on to read that, because I think in a few minutes might be the right time, this idea of it being turned on in itself, well, Lotto, there's a suggestion, and this will probably come up in the passage you're going to read. There's a suggestion that Worm killed Lotto and ate him. And this idea that the system Lotto created destroyed him, it ate him, it devoured him, is kind of viscerally brought to life in that moment. And it's horrific, but it's this sense
incredibly
that...
dark. I mean, this is the same. Just to put this in perspective, this is the origin of the Hobbit story. This is the origin of a children's story. This is the same location. This is not only the same universe. This is the same location as to where all of that began. We're not ending the Lord of the Rings with the return to the idyllic, completely unbesmirched English setting. Essentially, it is a parable for England in many ways. This is the most horrific idea. Not only have you had this, complete sort of decimation of the Shire, the enfeeblement of its population, this authoritarian regime imposed, but Bag End has essentially become this. Again, it's filthy. One thing I'll go into is that this is filthy, it's disgusting, it's full of rats. And the idea, the insinuation that there's also been cannibalism here as well. It is the most disgusting and pathetic imagery you can possibly sort of evoke within this setting, given everything that has been previously established.
And it gives it's almost an allusion, I guess you could make to the fall in the Garden of Eden. It kind of gives a lot of, it puts flesh on that idea that paradise. I know that the Shire is not perfect, but there is as you said, an idyllic quality to it. It's a place of goodness which is worth fighting for. And I think the films really do a good job of presenting that cannibalism could happen at the very heart of this place when it's unwatched, unprotected. That's quite shocking and disturbing. On that fun note, would you like to read the passage? Because I think it kind of delves into that.
Yes, absolutely. This is about 3 pages long. So if you have anything to, obviously I'm not, you're the host, so you can butt in as much as you want. But yes, I'll just read this.
Go ahead.
Where is that miserable Lotto hiding? Said Mary. They had searched every room and found no living thing save rats and mice. Shall we turn on the others to search the sheds? And again, this is in Bag End. This is worse than Mordor, said Sam. Much worse in a way. It comes home to you, as they say, because it is home, and you remember it before it was all ruined. Yes, this is Mordor, said Frodo. Just one of its works. Saruman was doing its work all the time, even when he thought he was working for himself. And the same with those that Saruman tricked, like Lotto. Merry looked around in dismay and disgust. Let's get out, he said. If I had known all the mischief he had caused, I should have stuffed my pouch down Saruman's throat. No doubt, but you did not. And so
Just
I
to
am
say,
able...
sorry, just to say that's the tobacco he gave to Saruman on the road when they bumped into him as a beggar.
Yes, absolutely. No doubt, but you did not. And so I am able to welcome you home. There, standing at the door, was Saruman himself, looking well fed and well pleased. His eyes gleamed with malice and amusement. A sudden light broke on Frodo. "Sharky," he cried. Saruman laughed. "So you have heard the name, have you? All my people used to call me that in Isengard. I believe a sign of affection, possibly. But evidently you did not expect to see me here." "I did not," said Frodo, "but I might have guessed. A little mischief, in a mean way. Gandalf warned me that you were still capable of it." "Quite capable," said Saruman, "and more than a little. You made me laugh, you hobbit lordlings, riding along with all those great people, so secure and so pleased with your little selves. You thought you had done very well out of it all, and could now just amble back and have a nice quiet time in the country. Saruman's home could be all wrecked, and he could be turned out, but no one could touch yours. Oh no, Gandalf would look after your affairs." Saruman laughed again. "Not he. When his tools have done their task, he drops them. But you must go, dangling after him, dawdling and talking, and riding round twice as far as you needed. Well, thought I, if they are such fools, I will get ahead of them and teach them a lesson. One ill turn deserves another. I were to be in a sharper lesson. If only you had given me a little more time and more men. Still, I have already done much that you will find it hard to amend or undo in your lives, and it will be pleasant to think of that and set it against my injuries." "Well, if that is what you find pleasure in," said Frodo, "I pity you. It will be a pleasure of memory only, I fear. Go at once and never return." The hobbits of the village had seen Saruman come out of one of the huts, and at once they came crowding up to the door of Bag End. When they heard Frodo's command, they murmured angrily, "Don't let him go! Kill him! He's a villain and a murderer! Kill him!" Saruman looked around at the hostile faces and smiled. "Kill him," he mocked. "Kill him. If you think there are enough of you, my brave hobbits." He drew himself up and stared at them darkly with his black eyes. "But do not think that when I lost all my goods, I lost all my power. Whoever strikes me shall be accursed, and if my blood stains the Shire, it shall wither and never again be healed." The hobbits recoiled, but Frodo said, "Do not believe him. He has lost all power, save his voice that can still daunt you and deceive you if you let it. But I will not have him slain. It is useless to meet revenge with revenge. It will heal nothing. Go, Saruman, by the speediest way." "Worm! Worm!" Saruman called, and out of a nearby hut came Wormtongue, crawling almost like a dog. "To the road again, Worm," said Saruman. "These fine fellows and lordlings are turning us adrift again. Come along." Saruman turned to go, and Wormtongue shuffled after him. But even as Saruman passed close to Frodo, a knife flashed in his hand, and he stabbed swiftly. The blade turned on the hidden mail coat and snapped. A dozen hobbits, led by Sam, leaped forward with a cry and flung the villain to the ground. Sam drew his sword. "No, Sam," said Frodo. "Do not kill him, even now, for he has not hurt me, and in any case, I do not wish him to be slain in this evil mood. He was great once, of a noble kind that we should not dare to raise our hands against. He is fallen, and his cure is beyond us, but I would still spare him in the hope that he may find it." Saruman rose to his feet and stared at Frodo. There was a strange look in his eyes of mingled wonder and respect and hatred. "You have grown, halfling," he said. "Yes, you have grown very much. You are wise and cruel. You have robbed my revenge of sweetness, and now I must go hence in bitterness, in debt to your mercy. I hate it, and you. Well, I go, and I will trouble you no more. But do not expect me to wish you health and long life. You will have neither, but that is not my doing. I merely foretell. He walked away, and the hobbits made a lane for him to pass, but their knuckles whitened as they gripped on their weapons. Wormtongue hesitated, and then followed his master. Wormtongue, called Frodo, you need not follow him. I know of no evil you have done me. You can have rest and food here for a while, until you are stronger and can go your own ways. Wormtongue halted and looked back at him, half prepared to say. Saruman turned. No evil, he cracked. Oh no. Even when he sneaks out at night, it is only to look at the stars. But did I hear someone ask where poor Lotto is hiding? You know, don't you, Worm? Will you tell them? Wormtongue cowered down and whimpered, No, no. Then I will, said Saruman. Worm killed your chief, poor little fellow, your nice little boss. Didn't you, Worm? Stabbed him in his sleep, I believe. Buried him, I hope, though Worm has been very hungry lately. No, Worm is not really nice. You had better leave him to me. A look of wild hatred came into Wormtongue's red eyes. You told me to. You made me do it, he hissed. Saruman laughed. You do what Sharky says, always, don't you, Worm? Well, now he says follow. He kicked Wormtongue in the face as he grovelled, and turned and made off. But at that something snapped. Suddenly, Wormtongue rose up, drawing a hidden knife, and then with a snarl like a dog, he sprang on Saruman's back, jerked his head back, cut his throat, and with a yell, ran off down the lane. Before Frodo could recover or speak a word, 3 hobbit bows twanged, and Wormtongue fell dead. To the dismay of those that stood by, about the body of Saruman, a grey mist gathered, and rising slowly to a great height like smoke, from a fire as a pale shrouded figure, it loomed over the hill. For a moment it wavered, looking to the west, but out of the west came a cool wind, and it bent away, and with a single sigh, dissolved into nothing. Frodo looked down at the body with pity and horror, for as he looked, it seemed that long years of death were suddenly revealed in it, and it shrank, and the shriveled face became rags of skin upon a hideous skull. Lifting up the skirt of the dirty cloak that sprawled beside it, he covered it over and turned away.
Beautifully read. Beautifully read. I'm looking forward to your audiobook. But yeah, I mean, there's so much to jump into. I'm aware that we're running short of time. So if there were, what is there something you would like to pick out of that passage in particular?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think just to illustrate, I think the ending is completely perfect for Saruman. I mean, again, this is something I'll probably never forgive. I mean, especially in the theatrical versions of the film, which entirely omit Saruman, because it is you can see the perfect ending of Saruman's thematic arc, to use a rather overtired phrase. Saruman begins this whole process, seeking after power, seduced by the nature of power, and even alluding to that. The hobbits admit that this isn't just Saruman's doing, but rather this is the echo, essentially, of Saruman's machinations. Even though Saruman, at one point may have wanted to ally or even supplant Sauron, rather. In the event, all Saruman is essentially is this lesser echo of Sauron, and all that Sauron is ultimately able to reap is devastation and destruction in his pursuit for order, essentially. Saruman tried that at Isengard. He failed. He now tried to impose it as some sort of, again, bitter revenge on the Shire of all places, and now he has failed. And now he is literally reduced to nothing. And again, just to emphasize the scale of the fall, he is one of the Maya. He is one of these angelic beings from essentially the Lord of the Rings equivalent of heaven. one of the beings essentially set apart from other men. I mean, the appearance of wizards is just a form that they take essentially that of old men to provide wise counsel. In many ways, one of the allusions I have always sort of taken from the Astari, at least in Tolkien's conception, given the fact that he was writing this as a Catholic, is that the Astari almost represents some form of pentarchy, i.e., the great five bishops. Of course, in this world, that would be the bishops of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. And this is someone who was meant essentially to be that voice of wisdom, that spiritual strength, which Gandalf has exemplified essentially, to allow others to run themselves more effectively, but never to take that power and impose that order on other people. And as a result of this, we have this corruption which has essentially become Saruman, and ultimately all that is left of Saruman is this physical form of corruption. And I can't help but feel, this somehow relates again to our own predicament, how I feel that in many ways we are living in this, regrettably, this form of terminal decline regarding our culture. And I feel this is indicative of our elites as much as anyone else. And I feel that this is a parable, I hate, obviously, when Tolkien says he hates allegory, he gets around it by using a very, very narrow definition of what it means to be allegorical. So I will use the word allegory here. But really, Saruman encapsulates eternal negation. There is no hint of remorse. There is no reconciliation. There is no atonement. He becomes more bitter and prideful and sinful, and he becomes the force of eternal negation. And that is the end of Saruman. It's why Saruman is probably one of my favorite characters in all of Lord of the Rings.
It really points to as well, I think, the idea that there are people who are just genuinely vengeful or malicious. This is something that Gandalf points to when he's first explaining the threat of the ring to Frodo. In reference to Sauron, he mentions that it would Sauron doesn't need hobbits as slaves, but it would make him very happy because he wants revenge and malice. And this is exactly who Saruman is. He's just doing this out of vengeance, of a perceived slight. I think that's quite helpful because oftentimes there's an attempt to explain people's behavior away as, or they think they're doing the right thing, or they think they're doing the good. The unconstrained vision of, as Thomas Sowell would talk about, as these people who force people to do things that they think are in their interest.
I must say, I think I prefer the old adage by Thomas Sowell, the vision of the anointed. I think in this case it has some more literal connotations in the case of Saruman.
Well, he starts out that way, of course. His initial invitation to Gandalf is, well, if we ally or usurp Sauron, we will be able to make the world accordance to knowledge, order, reason, etc., etc. So we can make the world a better place. But by the end, he's totally twisted and just wants to inflict cruelty. And I think that's really crystallizes how that could be real.
Yes, and I think this is why it's so brilliant, because the corresponding level of power in Saruman, literal power in terms of his wizardly power, and his political power in terms of the effect he has on others, is almost correlated with the scope of his ambition. So at the height of his power, he wants everything. And now at the absolute depths of, this pathetic sort of creature is turned into, Sharky, not even Saruman, his motivations have debased as well. Everything about him is debased. It is an omni-debasement, essentially.
And on the flip side, we have Frodo, who gives maybe what might be considered a surprising response to Saruman, or something we wouldn't expect. Most of the hobbits want to kill him. I guess an eye for an eye, or justice needs to be done. But Frodo, throughout this whole chapter, is very reticent at seeing anybody killed. He constantly pleads with hobbits to refrain from killing if possible, and definitely don't kill any hobbits. And then at the end, we see Frodo say, "No, do not slay Saruman. I want to give him a chance of repentance, even though it's a far-fetched hope, and he's a higher being we should respect." And then even after he is assaulted, he still maintains this position of forgiveness and mercy. And this might seem very surprising to most of the audience, but it makes sense within the narrative arc of Frodo if we consider that Frodo started out having a view that Gollum should be killed,
Yes.
as he is a threat to the quest to destroy the ring. But in time, he actually has mercy on Gollum. He has pity on him.
And who instigates this? Of course, it's Gandalf.
It's Gandalf, yes.
Gandalf gives Frodo that appreciation of showing pity on Gollum. And I believe this is, again, not entirely Frodo's victory, but this is also Gandalf's victory.
Mm-hmm.
Gandalf, through this process, through his hands-off process, for the fact that he is simply there, he's essentially there to buttress. He's there to steal the hearts of the followers. He's there essentially to launch the inception of this kingdom, but he's not there to rule it. And in terms of his actual tangible effect, in terms of his influence, I think this is perfectly exhibited in Frodo. Frodo is doing everything that Gandalf in his prime would have wanted him essentially to do. And I think this is the ultimate victory of both Frodo and Gandalf over Saruman.
Definitely. And just to kind of finish off that point, if Frodo hadn't had mercy on Gollum, the ring would never have been destroyed. It's not as clear in the film, I think, but in the book, Gollum takes the ring and he slips off the edge into the lava below, and that's how the ring is destroyed. So it really wouldn't have been destroyed without Smeagol's intervention, which wouldn't have been possible without mercy. And we see a parallel with this in the character of Wormtongue in a strange way, because Worm, he had been misleading King Theoden of Rohan. He had almost made him. The line is, "Your leechcraft would have made me almost crawling like on my hands and knees, like a beast." Well, that's exactly how Worm ends up with his own, by his own problem. But Theoden gives him a chance of mercy. He says, "You can join me, or you can go wherever you want. But if I see you again, you will be my enemy, and I will kill you." It's that mercy that Theoden shows to Worm, which allows for the opportunity for Worm to end Saruman. If Worm isn't there, nobody kills Saruman in this episode, and he goes somewhere else and probably wreaks havoc on another group of people for a short time. So you can see there a parallel between Wormtongue and Gollum, and the mercy shown to both, allowing for a closure of, or an overthrow of evil.
Yes, exactly. I think I don't, again, understand necessarily the motivations. I mean, I can understand the knee-jerk shock reaction of hobbits felling Wormtongue, but I probably would have liked to see a bit more of a tangible redemption for Worm, rather than just this felling at the end. I think that was probably perhaps unnecessary. But yes, I think, and again, this is also the same thing that happens to Saruman, the great scene in the Two Towers, where Isengard is upset, and there is this conversation, from Orthanc directed downwards between Theoden and Gandalf. And of course, both of them are given the chance, and then they embark and do this. So yes, I think, if nothing else, I hope that people watching this would feel the need to pick up the books and read this chapter. If nothing else than morbid curiosity, given the fact that this was, all of this was entirely omitted from the films. There's probably one question I'd like to ask before we go, Nathan, which is, what do you feel about that? Its inclusion or omission within the films?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I think I understand why it was taken out. I think if you were going to include it, you would need to frame the story in terms of the importance of the actual climax of the story is the restoration of the Shire. And that might be you would have to change the quest of the ring quite significantly, I think, to be able to do that. So yeah, I say include it. I get what's your feeling?
Well, my feeling is include it, but I can understand for a general audience, just seeing that and having gone through the Lord of the Rings and having gone through the demise of Sauron, and the centrality of Sauron, the enemy, to that story, and then having come home and been confronted with this seemingly out of nowhere, I can understand how it would be confusing. So from an audience point of view, I can understand why they omitted it, but from a thematic point of view, I really think this scene, not only is it incredibly insightful in terms of our perception of the author and his intentions for it, and what possibly in his own life informed this. We've had a stab at that, but like I said, I think we both elucidated that this is a culmination. The characters don't change through this process, but this is the characters at their height and Saruman at his lowest point, acting in accordance with everything that has preceded this moment. And I think in that sense, it is a beautiful and poignant, bittersweet ending to Lord of the Rings, rather than something which is explicitly happy.
See, the problem with the film is it says Sauron is the great enemy, whereas really it was Lotto Sackville Baggins all along. He is the real Dark Lord.
Yes.
But on that note, I think that's a lovely note to finish on. And I just want to thank you once again, Apostolic Majesty, for joining and making this a really fantastic discussion.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's been really fun to talk about. I've wanted to talk about this for several years now. It's again something I reread for pleasure over and over again, even if I don't necessarily, well, not for pleasure necessarily, not morbid curiosity perhaps, but it's something I have enjoyed reading, even if I don't necessarily read the entire books along with it every single time. So yes, thank you very much, Nathan, for having me. Wonderful discussion.
And everybody, I hope you are staying with us for Tolkien Day and looking forward to some further great discussions of Tolkien and his work. In the meantime, it's goodbye from me, and see you soon.
Goodbye.